Well, National Treasury has approved a 47 billion rand support package for Transnet. This has drawn criticism, though, from the Democratic Alliance. That is due to Transnet's financial and operational problems in recent years. The rail operator was granted access to nearly 50% of the package to address liquidity concerns. That comes up to just over 22 billion rand. For more on this, let's speak to Mike Walwyn, Director at the South African Association of Freight Forwarders. A very good evening to you. Good to have your time tonight, sir. You've said this is of critical importance. In fact, you said it's a test of critical importance for Transnet and the country. How so?
Yes, I mean, if we look across the whole of Transnet, essentially, we're talking about the ports and the railways. Those things are what you might call the arteries of the country. If they're not functioning, the country doesn't function. That's simple. They are the blood to the body. So that's why it's important. Why it's terribly urgent is because of what we've all been seeing, the build-up of ships outside the harbours. And to Transnet's credit, by the way, there is action going on now. That's been dropped a little bit. And you've seen the big truck queues on the N4 and the N2 outside Richards Bay. All of that is a result of failings in the Transnet infrastructure and its operation. It's that critical. We do need to fix it, and we need to fix it now.
However, you've also noted that in the announcement by Treasury on Friday, that there are still details that are missing as to where exactly this money is going to be spent and how that will in turn resolve what is a very immediate crisis at the ports.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I have to say that they announced a 47 billion rand guarantee. That's not funds, simply a guarantee which will enable Transnet to borrow and on better terms and to get borrowing. So 47 billion. Now of that, Transnet is saying it needs 23, if I'm not mistaken, 23 odd billion to settle immediate commitments, which I would assume are old debt commitments that it has to settle. So that leaves another 24 or so left over. If they're going to use that on the kind of hardware which we know they need and on the maintenance programs they need, and if they're going to use it in partnership, and that's a really key thing here. We as private sector are there to support Transnet and work with it. I'm not suggesting privatization, but we need to follow a world model where infrastructural facilities in logistics are often shared by governments with private sector partners who have international, worldwide experience in these things, and that's all we're suggesting. And we think it has to happen sooner rather than later. It has happened to a small extent because Transnet has announced a partnership, or partnership in principle, with a major Filipino terminal operator, multinational, and we welcome that. That would be for Pier 2 in Durban, which is our biggest container terminal. But the rest are open to question, and they all have problems. And that's the container side. And then Richards Bay, I'm sure you know all about it, has its own problems because the railway line isn't able to bring the coal in. So it really is that important that we have to get it moving tomorrow if we can.
Just on the issue of potential partnerships with the private sector and Transnet, even President Ramaphosa, when he was in KwaZulu-Natal in the last week or so, referred to that as one of the potential solutions. How would that be split up, I wonder, in terms of collaboration? Is it a collaboration of equals? Who brings what to the table and what would they get or seek in return, I wonder?
Okay, well, what your private sector brings to the table is the investment needed for certain infrastructure and, of course, the expertise and systems used in running terminals. What government brings to the party, and quite rightly so, is the ground that it owns and the harbours that it owns and all that is related to piers and all the other infrastructure, solid waterside infrastructure in harbours. That is rightly government specific. And if I can give you an example, we have in Maputo, the Maputo Port Authority, which is the same as our National Port Authority, and they're in partnership with a company, a major international company called DP World. DP World own 49% and the government owns 51%, and DP World have operational independence. It works very nicely. And that's not the only example I could give you. It happens all around the world. So that's really what we're doing.
And on the issue of the private sector, whenever it's mentioned, we know that Labour, for example, gets its back up and believes that basically what that means in collaborating with the private sector, it's a backdoor, if you will, to privatising Transnet, perhaps as a whole. Would that be such a bad thing, given the current scenario where there's been such serious mismanagement of the rail infrastructure and indeed, for example, the ports themselves, as we're seeing in Richards Bay?
Sure. I mean, it's a very good question. I think the unions are a very key factor in this. And we know that the unions have a strongly anti-privatisation stance. I may get some criticism from my colleagues. What I said just now, I believe. The state has a place in this. The state owns the property. And ultimately, the state must be involved and must be involved as a shareholder. Yes, you could go the entire privatisation route. I don't think, quite honestly, it would be worth the pain.
But are the right people, Mike, being put in place to run an entity such as Transnet? I mean, in the last, half a year, we've seen the resignation of senior people, including the CEO and CFO. And now we're hearing that plans to replace them are well afoot, and we're going to hear some sort of announcement soon.
Yes, that's a very valid point. I think the changes have been for the better. As you may know, there's an acting CEO in place, a lady called Michelle Phillips. We have had dealings with her over the years. We have great respect for her. We think she's got experience and competence, and we have to work with her, but she is the acting CEO. Now, I know I think, as you would know, I think there were 3 candidates published the other day for the final appointment. And that may or may not be, but I'm looking ahead of that and saying that one thing I know is that Transnet in its current form, under whatever management, is not the right vehicle. Now, I say this with great respect to Michelle Phillips because I think she's very good. But she cannot do the job without the resources that she needs, and I don't think she has.
What does she need most in order to make a success of it, especially if she does become appointed permanently?
Yeah, well, she or whoever, I mean, yes, she's there right now. What they need is the investment capital to build the infrastructure that is so desperately lacking, or to replace what hasn't been replaced, if I can put that more accurately. And she needs the injection of the technical expertise and the people expertise. You must not forget that one of the reasons we're in this hole is that 700 odd very skilled and competent people took voluntary retrenchment, and we offered that. I think that was a really terrible move, and it's denuded Transnet of skills that are desperately needed. It doesn't have those anymore, and you can't bring them up from ground level upwards. That's the thing you develop over years.
I want to ask you then about the situation at the ports, which we've been discussing, for the better part of November and now straight into December. Transnet has already admitted that it may take up to early next year to resolve it altogether. But where do things stand currently as far as the backlog of those trucks and the ships that were at sea carrying thousands of containers and waiting to deliver?
Yes, well, as of this morning, I think there was something like 26 ships waiting outside Durban. The other ports are not so badly impacted. But there's a rider to that. Cape Town, for example, had virtually nothing waiting outside. So you would think everything's going well. But that's not so. The vessels that should have come to Cape Town have gone elsewhere. The productivity, which is the key point there, rate at which they handle cargo in Cape Town is still shocking. And until they get that right, we will continue to have this kind of problem. And the same applies to all of them.
Mike Walwyn, good to speak to you, Director at the South African Association of Freight Forwarders. Good to talk to you. I'm sure we'll be speaking a lot more until that crisis at the ports is resolved.